Nothing does my heart better than seeing two very different musical styles being blended together and not having it end up like garbage. And yeah, Rolo Tomassi is just a master of that craft. Let's dive into it. Where Myth Becomes Memory by Rolo Tomassi. So Rolo Tomassi is how do I even describe them? They were one of the forefathers of blending a much more mellow, almost shoegaze, but for them, I felt it was a little bit more of like the indie rock outfits of like the mid 2000s with a guttural death metal approach. And unlike other bands like, Between the Buried and Me and Opeth that would blend the two, but predominantly have their feet in one style of like death metal, I feel like Rolo Tomassi did a perfect job of balancing both so that one never outshine the other. And this album actually marks their seventh full-length album. The only other album from them that I've heard is Time Will Die and Love Will Bury It, the one that they released back in 2018, and I fell in love with this album. This was the kind of album that kept me like aware of their presence and very excited for whatever they did next. So now we have the follow-up of When Myth Becomes Memory, and they continue that brilliance from Time Will Die and Love Will Bury It. I'm loving so many of the different soundscapes on here, and they're masters of allowing the style of music that they're playing have center stage and not get overshadowed by one or the other style. And the first thing that I really want to get out of the way is the lead vocals of Eva Spence. Her vocals just bleed brilliance. Not only is she able to capture this more heavenly style of singing, that very like indie artist from the mid 2000s, but she's also able to scream and yell and belt it out like any other top-notch death metal growler or screamer. Her vocals on this are bleeding with beauty in both camps. And I know a lot of vocalists are able to handle one or the other, but it's really hard to handle both so seamlessly, especially in so many of these different tracks. Now, the one thing that I really want to shine the light on is their use of, and I'm trying to think of the best way to say this, but like actual piano on here. Like so many bands will use the keyboards that have the piano setting on it rather than using an actual piano. And the main way that you can tell is listening for the reverberations inside the piano themselves, which true, keyboards are sophisticated enough to reproduce that, but what you're always missing is because you aren't just miking directly, well, you're not miking at all, you're actually just a direct feed from the keyboards into the recording stylus or the recording thing, you're not getting the actual recorded sound of the room, and specifically the keys hitting and hearing that like that percussive sound in the keys themselves, like actually hearing it hit and wait, like the hammers in the pianos actually hitting the keys, the actual like ivory themselves being hit. Like this starts and ends the third track of Mutual Ruin, and I'm going to get into the specific tracks in a bit. I just kind of want to use these as jumping off points. Mutual Ruin opens and closes with this piano work. And the other track that does this is the kind of interlude track, the 8th track of Stumbling. The whole track itself is a play out from the previous track of Presence. And again, I just love that piano work. I love the actual, like it feels more real. It feels like they're in the studio, you're there with them, and you're engaging in the music overall. And I really, really appreciate the fact that they didn't rely on keyboards. They actually used proper piano. Either that or they did an extremely convincing work of providing that essence to it. So let's get into the tracks proper. Let's talk about the tracks proper. The album opens up beautifully with Almost Always. It's a crescendo of sound. It almost has that like shoegazer crescendo core as it's been labeled before. And unlike other tracks where out of nowhere, it will do a switch, and it's like the first minute or so, and then bam, it hits you over the head. This is about 6.5 minutes worth of just pure symphonic indie music, and I love it. And I also love that the second track of Cloaked is the punch of the face of that hardcore death metal music. So you have these two tracks that open the album very, very well with that, like, two sides of this band. And I really do love the dichotomy of this, like the foils that these two tracks play against one another. And then both of these are married together with Mutual Ruin. And Mutual Ruin is one of my favorite tracks off of this because it's able to balance both expressions in a singular track. The first half of the track is just that guttural, balls to the wall insanity that I love with this. It's hard hitting, it's growly. Eva is just screaming her, I almost said balls off. I guess her tits off. I guess that's the equivalent there. And it's just raw, it's powerful, it's energetic. And then the second half is so much more emotional. And this is part of the reason why I love this, because, there's no light without the shadows, right? And you can't have shadows without some kind of a light. And so it's proving and it's showing that both styles of music are complementing one another, right? Like the first part of the track is extremely bombastic, but the second part, it's like a release. It's very cathartic at the end of that. And you can't have that without the intake of breath. So I love how Mutual Ruin kind of has that payoff that the first two tracks set up. And I do like how the next three tracks, Labyrinthine, Closer, and Drip, do pass the baton between one another in terms of hard, light, and heart. So Labyrinthine is a very brutal track. It's very hard hitting. I love how Closer, again, one of my favorite tracks off of here, is just so somber. It's so intimate. It's so heavenly in that sense. And Drip is one of the more like intense tracks, which really says something. I'm really loving the drum works on here, how relentless it is, which does flow perfectly into Presence. And this is one of the few times where it doesn't go soft, hard, soft, hard. Drip and Presence are like very hard hitting, and that relentlessness of Drip continues with Presence. Though luckily Presence does what Mutual Ruin did in that the first half of the track is very hard hitting. It's continuing that momentum that we had from Drip, but by the second half, it just kind of like lets itself off into like the shoegazy, very atmospheric, almost pastel like picture scene. And I'm loving how it's able to blend both without feeling like the momentum is being lost as though we're in a completely different song. It's still rooted very singularly into the actual theme that's going on within this track. And so I already talked about Stumbling being kind of like the interlude track before we get into To Resist Forgetting. And To Resist Forgetting, unlike the other two tracks that kind of do both musical styles at the same time, like Mutual Ruin and Stumbling, where the first half is very heavy, second half is very light, I feel like To Resist Forgetting is kind of them stirring the pot a little bit in that case. They're trying something a little bit new. They're recontextualizing things that have been presented before by kind of within the track themselves, going from hard, soft, and again, much like Mutual Ruin and Stumbling, you never feel like it's missing a beat. It's all very natural. It goes from one passage to another without losing any momentum in that case. And what I particularly like about To Resist Forgetting is the build-up that we have near the midpoint of this track. It sets the stage for the play-out in the second half, and we get a lot more harmonizations of the other band members. Like James Spence and Tom Pitts both lend their voices here to create some really interesting three-part harmonies that you would think would blend very, very well in a more somber setting, but it's actually in the more heavy-handed settings that they're lending their voices, and I really appreciate this recontextualizing of the harmonizations within the vocals, because most of the time within these harder sections, it's just Eva just screaming her tits off the entire time, and it doesn't really leave any room for those harmonizations to occur. So when the harmonizations do occur within these hard, brutal moments, it provides such a very great dynamic within the music structure itself. And finally, the album ends with a beautiful and perfect ending with The End of Eternity, and it is, again, the soft setting out that I particularly love. And it does remind me a little bit of some of the more crescendo-y moments that we had from Deaf Heaven, specifically like Infinite Granite, where this is where she's screaming, she's yelling, but the music is never like the blast beats. It's very somber. It's very impressionistic. It has a lot more of that shoegaze moment, like, again, the crescendo core in that sense, the chugging guitars, but they're not overlaid with reverberations. They're not like distorted out of control. They're very clean in that sense. And I like how, much like To Resist Forgetting had the harmonizing within the blast beats, this track has the screaming, the yelling within more of the softer moments. Again, Rolo Tomassi just knocked it out of the park. I've been loving this. I love this style of music. This is really where I find my home in that case. And I had a blast. I think this is a great starting point for Rolo Tomassi. If you've never heard them and you love, I mean, this is a hard album to kind of recommend, right? Because if you love the blast beats, but you're not a big fan of the very ethereal, very impressionistic kind of guitar works, you might not necessarily enjoy this. You might find there are points that are boring on this album, but if you're a fan of the more symphonic indie stuff, you might find that this is a little too sharp for your taste. So if you're somebody that kind of loves genre bending like I do, then you're going to love this album, and this is a perfect starting point to then go back and listen to the rest of their back catalog. Not too much else to say besides Where Myth Becomes Legend is absolutely one that I love with my whole heart. So yeah, this one gets the note seal of approval. This one gets a run, don't walk to go and listen to it. I want to say you won't be disappointed, but it is a slight acquired taste. So there you go. There you go. That's what I've got for Where Myth Becomes Memory from Rolo Tomassi. What did you guys think about this album? Did you love it? Did you hate it? Whatever you thought, please let me know by commenting down below. The album's been out for a while, so hopefully some opinions have been made about it. So that's about it. Thank you all so much for watching, and I want to give a special big thank you to Tim W., my latest Patreon. If you want to be cool like Tim, you can head on over to my Patreon. If you like what you see and you want to help support me, that's a perfect way to do so. I've left the link down below, and one more time, thank you to Tim W. for helping to support me. And that's all I've got. So again, thank you all so much for watching. As always, you guys are definitely the best. And until next time, notes out.